Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to be looking at the math behind one of the most hotly debated, densely packed topics of our time. But here's the catch. We're leaving the politics entirely at the door. We're putting on our financial auditor hats, embracing radical neutrality, and looking strictly at the ledger. In this Explainer, we're focusing on hard, nonpartisan data from the Congressional Budget Office and the Baker Institute at Rice University to map out the true economic ledger of the recent immigration surge. Okay, let's dive into this. It's literally the ultimate question, right? Beyond all the political rhetoric and the endless news cycles, what is the actual, verifiable economic cost or benefit of this surge in immigration? Like, how does it truly affect the national debt, our gross domestic product, and the actual budgets of our local states and towns? Well, we're going to follow the money. We're strictly relying on the source data to map out exactly how this surge impacts the math behind the headlines. To understand the economic impact, we first have to wrap our heads around the undeniable scale of this. We are looking at a projected surge population of 8.7 million people between 2021 and 2026. This data comes straight from the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO. In their recent analysis, they define this specific group as other foreign nationals, meaning individuals entering the country who aren't lawful permanent residents or temporary visa holders. 8.7 million is a massive addition to the population over just a 5-year span. In a demographic shift of that magnitude, it inevitably sends profound financial ripples through the entire economy.
Section 1. The Federal Ledger. Let's take a macro-level view.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the financial inputs versus the outputs when we examine the CBO's 10-year economic forecast from 2024 to 2034. Over that 10-year window, the CBO projects this immigration surge will actually generate a staggering $1.2 trillion in new federal tax revenues. This is primarily driven by individual income taxes and payroll taxes. Against that massive revenue stream, the CBO calculates $0.3 trillion, so $300 billion, in mandatory federal spending and interest on the debt associated with this population.
When you subtract that $300 billion in costs from the $1.2 trillion in revenues, you arrive at a pretty surprising clinical conclusion. According to the CBO's calculations, the net effect of the immigration surge on the federal budget is a deficit reduction of $900 billion over 10 years. Let me just repeat that. It actually reduces the federal deficit by nearly $1 trillion on the macro level. But how exactly are these massive revenues generated in the first place?
Section 2, Labor and GDP Growth. Economic output. To understand where all these massive tax revenues originate, we really need to look at the broader economic output. The CBO projects that this surge in immigration will inject a massive $8.9 trillion boost to the total nominal gross domestic product over that 2024 to 2034 period. Now, GDP is just the total value of everything produced in the economy. An $8.9 trillion expansion, that means significantly more economic activity, rising corporate profits, and crucially, a much larger tax base for the federal government to draw from. So let's break down that $8.9 trillion GDP boost. Pure population size is by far the biggest factor, contributing $7.8 trillion. Simply having millions of more people buying groceries, renting apartments, and paying for services drives massive baseline growth. But look at these other pillars. $1.5 trillion comes from greater labor force participation, largely because this surge population tends to skew younger and enters the workforce at really high rates. Finally, $600 billion is driven directly by STEM innovation. The CBO explicitly notes that immigrants working in science, technology, engineering, and math fields significantly boost innovation and overall productivity across the entire economy. Now you might be wondering, if they just arrived, how are they paying taxes while using so few federal resources? Well, let's break down the complex legal timelines that dictate this whole process. When individuals in this surge population arrive, they become subject to sales and payroll taxes almost immediately the second they participate in the economy. Within an average of about 6 months, many receive official employment authorization. However, federal law strictly limits their access to federal benefits. Even for those who eventually achieve what's legally termed qualified alien status, there's typically a strict 5-year waiting period before they can access major federal programs like Medicaid or food assistance. So this timeline perfectly explains the federal surplus. They contribute to tax revenues years before they're legally allowed to consume major federal benefits. Section 3, the state-level burden. Local realities. While the federal government is projecting this massive profit,
local budgetary realities look very different. Unlike the feds, state and local municipalities bear severe upfront costs, and they have to do it without the massive income tax collection power of the IRS. By law, states must provide certain services immediately to anyone residing within their borders. We're talking compulsory public schooling for all children, immediate emergency health care, the state matching portion of Medicaid funding, and the heavy, sudden strain on local infrastructure and housing. So while the federal deficit shrinks, states and cities are the ones actually writing the checks for these immediate, on-the-ground realities.
Section 4, the Texas Case Study. Baker Institute Data. To make this state-level data a bit more tangible, we're going to look at a highly detailed case study from the Baker Institute for Public Policy. They anchored their study in the year 2018, noting that at the time, Texas had an estimated 1.6 million undocumented residents. That figure represented 5.7% of the state's total population. With a population sample this large and an unemployment rate of just 5.7% among this group, who work heavily in construction, agriculture, and manufacturing, Texas serves as an incredibly robust and representative sample for analyzing real local economic impact. So let's balance the state ledger for Texas. The study found that in fiscal year 2018, Texas collected $2.4 billion in state revenues from this undocumented population. This came through sales taxes, consumer taxes on items like gasoline, and property taxes, whether on homes they owned or taxes passed through to them via their rent. On the other side of the ledger, Texas spent $2.0 billion on services for this exact same group, specifically in areas like public education, healthcare, and state incarceration costs. And this brilliantly illustrates the data-driven reality of the situation. As Jose Ivan Rodriguez Sanchez, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Baker Institute, concluded after reviewing the numbers, even if we consider the costs of undocumented immigrants to the state of Texas, the benefits outweigh the costs. When you completely strip away the political arguments and simply audit the Texas state tax receipts against the state expenditures, the state actually came out mathematically ahead. I want to highlight this specific, striking metric because it honestly distills the entire study down to its core. For every single dollar the state of Texas spent on public services for undocumented immigrants, they collected $1.21 in revenue. That ultimately resulted in a net fiscal benefit of approximately $420.9 million for the state in that single fiscal year. The researchers also audited a completely alternative scenario. What would happen if all undocumented workers were removed from the state? The financial outcome of that scenario was massive. Deporting all undocumented workers would result in a severe $70.3 billion economic shock to the Texas economy in lost direct employment compensation alone. That would represent a 7.7% reduction in total state employment compensation, which would radically disrupt the local industries that rely heavily on this workforce. Let's move to Section 5, the long-term horizon, and see how this builds. Let's zoom back out to the national level and look even further down the road with the CBO. In the long run, they project several absolutely fascinating macroeconomic shifts. First, while immigrants in the surge initially earn less, the data models show wage convergence, meaning their wages actually catch up to native-born workers with similar education levels within about 8 years. Second, and perhaps most surprisingly, because of the larger tax base and the reduced national debt to GDP ratio, the CBO projects that this surge would actually apply downward pressure on federal interest rates by the year 2044. Add in the continued innovation-driven productivity from STEM workers and a long-term expansion of the tax base, and the macroeconomic trajectory is distinctly upward. So the crucial point is this. When we audit the data with absolute neutrality, we find a profound and honestly difficult tension. On one hand, we have undeniable upfront burdens placed directly on state and local governments who must build the schools and staff the emergency rooms today. Yet, simultaneously, we have massive, undeniable long-term gains for the federal budget and the national GDP tomorrow. How do we balance these immediate, localized costs against the massive, long-term national gains? It's a highly complex economic equation, and one that requires us to look past the rhetoric and closely at the true economic ledger. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and we'll see you next time as we dive into another fascinating dataset.